Our distinguished guests, fellow colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Hong Kong Palace Museum and good afternoon. I'm George Ma, Head of Learning and Engagement of the Hong Kong Palace Museum. Thank you for joining the HAPM Master Talk series. It's a great honor today to welcome our speaker, Professor Jessica Rawson, to give a talk. She gave a talk titled Jade and Gold, Chinese and Eurasian Culture Compared. Today's talk is jointly organized by the Department of Fine Arts from the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Palace Museum.北山堂 Foundation is the sponsor of the Distinguished Visiting Professor Program 2026 of the Department of Fine Art and the Institute of Chinese Studies from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Please note that the talk will be delivered in English with simultaneous interpretation in Putonghua. If you require a device, please raise your hand and let our volunteer help you. A big hello also to our online viewer. We have today a number of platforms, including the Hong Kong Palace Museum WeChat video account, Museum Headline, Jade, and also CHK Zoom webinar. Thank you for being with us online and on-site here. To start with, may we now please invite Dr. Loess, Director of the Hong Kong Palace Museum, to deliver a welcome remark. Dr. please.
Professor Jessica Rawson, Lillian, and Maggie, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Hong Kong Palace Museum. Aspiring to become Asia Global Museum, the Hong Kong Palace Museum is dedicated to the study and appreciation of Chinese art and culture, while advancing dialogue among world civilizations. We are committed to positioning Hong Kong as a hub for art and cultural exchange between Chinese mainland and the wider world, through exhibitions, research collaboration, and a range of educational and cultural programs. Among these initiatives, including the very popular Asian Egypt Unveiled exhibition and the Mongols Court exhibition, we are currently on view. You can go to to take a look on these two exhibitions after the lecture. Remember to buy the tickets. We also present various talk series which explore subjects ranging from specified exhibition themes to broader discussion of Chinese art and culture. Our Hong Kong PM Master Talk series invites leading experts from around the globe with outstanding research achievements to offer multi-perspective examinations of history, art, and cultural heritage. Today, we are very and deeply honored to have Professor Jessica Rawson with us. An internationally celebrated art historian and archaeologist, Professor Rawson is currently an honorary research associate at the University of Oxford and the 2026 Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Department of Fine Art and the Institute of Chinese Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, generously supported by the北山堂 Foundation. Her distinguished career has spanned both academia and the world and the museum world. At the University of Oxford, she served with great distinctions as Pro-Vice Chancellor between 2005 and 2010, and as the Warden of Merton College from 1994 to 2010. Before her talent at Oxford, Professor Rawson devoted over 2 decades to the British Museum, where she oversaw many of its most significant projects. As one of the leading authorities on ancient Chinese bronze, jades, ornamental system, and the burial practices, Professor Lawson has illuminated the intricate network of artistic and cultural exchange between China and Eurasian. Her scholarships has profoundly advanced the understanding of early Chinese material culture, and her publications remain fundamental works in the discipline. Today, Professor Lawson will share with her insights in her lecture titled Jade and Gold, Chinese and Eurasian Cultures Compared. Last but not least, we are immensely grateful to the Chinese University of Hong Kong for organizing her lecture series in Hong Kong, and to the北山堂Foundation for their generous sponsorship. Without their support, Professor Rawson's visit to Hong Kong could not have been realized so meaningfully. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Professor Jessica Rawson.
Yes, if you can't hear me, wave your hands. Thank you very much, Director, for a wonderful welcome to this very distinguished and fascinating museum. We spent a wonderful short period looking at the textile display and look forward to looking at further displays later. I would also like to thank, of course, the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the北山堂Foundation for supporting me, and for all of you who have come to hear me talk. And it's a rare opportunity for me to be in Hong Kong. This is the first time for more than 10 years that I have been giving lectures here, and it's a wonderful tonic for looking at other parts of the world. Though we talk about jade and gold here today, in fact, I'm looking much more widely, and I'm looking both at the Far East and at the West, and to see China in that much larger context. And I must thank many, many people across the whole of China, particularly in the mainland and in Hong Kong and Taiwan, for giving me so much support and so much interest in the whole of China. Without that, I would not be here giving lectures. It was and has been the biggest thrill or excitement of my life. But China for a foreigner is a strange experience. And the first thing that I've recognized from the very beginning and down to today is that the Chinese civilization differs pretty strongly from what we call civilization in the West. So Western civilization and Chinese civilization are just very different. And that is the most important aspect of my talks here in Hong Kong, not just today, but in a few days' time and 2 days ago. 2 days ago, I emphasized the very special nature of China's architecture in wood on very important platforms. And this is rarely considered outside the Far East. So one of my biggest aims in life is actually to see China recognized for its culture and civilization in other parts of the world. And so today, the gold stands for the culture I know best, that is the culture of the Western world, and jade for the culture, your culture here in China. And of course, there's some jade in the West, but not much, and a lot of gold here, but much more in the West. So let's begin with seeing a pair of examples. This, of course, is exactly the shape and type of the. Here I'm using this special kind of laser pointer. I hope you can see it. The very soft gold and the very hard jade represents their qualities for all of us. But they do not cross the world terribly easily. And throughout this talk, I shall show you this map. This map is of great, great importance, and few people think about it. You have a different climate here. You know it only too well. In the summer, it's extremely hot and humid. And there is a boundary to that climate. It does not penetrate into Central Asia or the steppe. And we have a different climate altogether. It rains in the winter, much too much, and we grow different crops. I shall talk about the crops a bit later, but they are fundamental to different cultures, because here in the middle is something very different and nobody talks about it. This is Tibet, of course, then there is the Xinjiang, and then you enter true Siberia. And this is the land of hunting and animal herding. It's a group of mobile people, and they live and work with animals. And this is very, very important, because it's this group of people who constantly penetrate both China and the West. And they are the communicators, the people who bring contact between these two very different and very separate civilizations and cultures. And this is the foundation, if you like, of the work that I've made over many decades. Now, we start by looking at these two different ornaments. Here you have the jades, you know, from the king of Nanyue, from Guangzhou, from very near you, which show a phoenix and a tiger slightly at war. They're attacking each other. Over here, you have a famous neck ornament, a pectoral, from the present-day Ukraine, from this area in the north of the Black Sea, and you see griffins attacking horses. So these are very different cultures with very different meanings, but above all, the material is different. So what is happening is that the people in the West have slightly impacted on the East to develop this open work, but the meaning and intention is entirely different. And if we look backwards in time, we see that we are in two different universes. This is the very early use of metallurgy around the Black Sea and in Anatolia. And there they're using gold very, very early. In this metal zone dates from 10,000 to 3,000 BC. So this is incredibly early metalwork, which in due course will make it to China. But meanwhile, in distant China, jade is forming and becoming the most important material of the elites throughout Eastern China. And it's very important that it's in Eastern China, from the extreme north in Heilongjiang, along here, the Hongshan culture, past North Korea, and into the main body of China, that the ornaments that we know first from in jade spread. They also spread to Japan, and also south as far as the Philippines. And one can argue that from there they spread into the Pacific. There are two very different minerals at work. One of them is malachite or cuprite, from which copper can be derived, and the other is jade or nephrite. Now you can ask, why do I start there? Well, one reason is that the very earliest time I had at the British Museum was to study their jades. So I've been looking at jades for a long time, and also Zhou Hotung from Hong Kong proved to be the greatest sponsor of my career and supported me and the British Museum for 30, 40 years. So I owe a lot to him and to his collection. And jade has remained one of the constant themes of my career. But I do not work on jade much anymore. But I'm very grateful that I had that very, very important opportunity. But why isn't copper so soon? Well, the answer is the Loess. The Loess that I spoke to last 2 days ago covers the whole of central northern China, and that hides all ores. There's plenty of copper there, but it's between 10 and hundreds of feet below the surface. It's not going to be the first thing that people discover. So one of the reasons why ore is not hit upon is the Loess. And we are grateful, we should be very grateful, that here in the Amur region, the first use of nephrite began and was followed down the coastal area of China. And we can follow it, as I did just now, in this slide. This is the work of Tan Chung from Hong Kong. And Shaonanhai is where the very earliest jades are found. They belong to a period when the Ice Age is only just ending, and this is an essential part of the development of the use of jade. And it's not only used here, but also in the Baikal region. So it's a very important, very northern material that gradually spreads south and is marked, if you like, by fine ornaments everywhere, fine ornaments, particularly ear ornaments. And this is what they look like. These are the very early ornaments from the north. And here in the Liangzhu culture near south of Shanghai, they develop further. Now, you all know the Liangzhu culture. I mentioned it in my first talk. I mentioned the enormously important water management that took place, making possible the building of this great city. And probably in the longer term, Liangzhu should be mentioned and remembered for the water management. But it is also known, of course, for the Zong. And here we have Liangzhu pieces from the British Museum. And in fact, all 4 pieces are from the British Museum, some from Zhou Hotung's collection, this very large one from much earlier date, and here one not from Liangzhu, but from the spread of the Zong across China. So if I go to the map, which I like very much, and one of my students who's here actually helped me produce it, Liangzhu is the source or origin of the Zong, if you like, and it spreads north and south as the climate change occurs and this becomes a flooded area. But it goes much further. It travels along rivers with people. It cannot travel alone. People must be taking it. And this is what I called in my last lecture examples of the footprint of something. This is the footprint of the jades of the Zong that is typical of the area of Liangzhu. So we are very fortunate that this transfer took place, if you like, in very early periods and left its footprint forever in China. The Zong and the jade, the nephrite, remains the most important material to collect, if you like, in China, and it owes its origin to this very much this eastern area and to the center of Liangzhu. And that in itself, in the history of China, is very surprising. But jade is one of the culture markers of China, or one of the markers of China's civilization, and it goes along with the development of a population here fed by the rice. But this area was flooded, and then things changed a lot, and people moved north. So I return again to this map and to the question of why could one move north? Because of course, if the rice is much more southern crop, what was happening here? And the answer is there is also millet, but there is not barley or wheat, which are the crops of my landscape in the West. So here I contrast the Western bread and the Eastern rice. And this is fundamental because the seasons in which we live and work over time depend on these seasons, and your seasons of harvesting rice are different from our seasons of harvesting wheat. And more than that, we cook in a different way. So in the far West, we cook in ovens. And if you go to a Chinese excavation, there are no ovens. Ovens are entirely dependent on the grains of wheat and barley and made into bread. Over here, we have cooking over fire in ceramic vessels, where the ceramics are, in fact, one of your great achievements and a real marker of your civilization. And they have a large role to play in life and in the afterlife. So in a tomb, you may find them in large measures here. So this is a typical Dawankou tomb, a Neolithic tomb of 300 to 2500 BC. And here you have a set of vessels. So I would like to emphasize that actually China is interested in large sets of everything. Sets of clothes, sets of jewelry, sets of vessels. You always have large sets. We are much less good at sets in the West because we have a smaller workforce and much less high quality. So the high quality set is a sign of China's culture. What we have as a difference is we have sculpture, which is usually worked by a smaller group of people, while you have ritual vessels which come in large sets in bronze. In a minute, I will talk about how bronze reached China. But I return to remind you, as you look on this map, that this is a very rough and dry area. And living in this part of the world, you herd animals. And so this part where the bronze vessels are, a world of rice and millet. On this side, the world of wheat and barley, but also a very large sea contact. So this is another very important feature, that Europe is broken into peninsulas and islands. China is a solid landmass. And so I think that part of the culture is run or allowed or managed by the sea, and much less so here in the Far East. And here are the animals. This is a scene in Mongolia where mixed herding is taking place. The mixture is sheep, goats, oxen, and some horses. And you need horses to manage the sheep. So that this is a different way of life that is dominant in the Far West, in the Far East, over the most immediate contact. You would not have a Silk Road, you would not have the steppe contact if there were not these animals. You have to have the animals to live, because you cannot grow large bundles of rice or millet. It's much, much too dry. And it's through the movement of people with animals over time. The animals arrive first, and they come from Western Asia. These animals were all domesticated in Western Asia, except for the horse, domesticated in the steppe. And now, if we want to look at the movement of metal, you see it on this map. The map shows you in color that the earliest metal is in this area, in the Balkans and Mesopotamia and Anatolia. And there is no doubt that the first metallurgy is developed there. And with the different colors, you see the red as it moves to China, but it enters India too, but doesn't cross India. And Southeast Asia receives metal last. So that this is a very important discovery of the many, many scientists who now work in archaeology, both in the West and in China. And without it, we would not be able to consider why and how metal reached China. So it's not just copper metallurgy, it also includes gold. So far, we've lost the gold. So where is the gold? What is happening is we can see from the weaponry in China, and this is a picture of weaponry of the Shang dynasty, that is of 1200 BC, that you can see that the weaponry is very closely modeled on Siberian weapons. So here we have a Siberian one and one from Anyang, a Siberian spear and one from Anyang, a chisel, a celt from Siberia and one from Anyang, and also for these different kinds of axe, if you like to call it. This is an axe from Siberia, and this is we would call it a halberd or gur, but it's got this form of hollow fitting round the shaft, which is definitely a Siberian one. So that at one level, we know that the enemy was the enemy from the steppe, and the Chinese modeled their weaponry on their enemies and fought them back. So that the weaponry has this rather unusual and strong modeling on those of their opponents. If we turn to the vessels, of course, they're entirely indigenous. The way of casting, the way of making these vessels is entirely local. And we see here the beginning of large sets of bronzes. China's much more wealthy in material, in copper, than the rest of the world. And it's very extravagant. It makes wonderful vessels, some of enormous size. But meanwhile, along the borderland to the north, weapons predominate. In the south, as Chinese spend time moving south, the vessels appear again here. So one of the important features of China is the ability to take over a technology from somewhere else and turn it entirely to their own use. And this continues today and is a very important feature of China now. So that in fact, the exchange and debate with the borderlands begins very early with the arrival of animals and continues for many hundreds of years. And we see it next with the emergence again of gold. So at the same time as the early vessels are being made, fragments of gold are being used. And this is a very recent find from Zhengzhou, that is from early Shang. And it was discovered in parts and fragments and only half the head of this creature. So it's been doubled, it's been photographed to appear to show a complete animal head, and the use of gold, turquoise, and in the shape of an animal head suggests that the contact is with further north. It's a very important discovery, and it's the first time that gold has been found in sufficient quantities in the center of China. So gold is coming in, but lots more has already arrived. The weapons have arrived, the animals have arrived, and then gold is used in a very small way. So we watch as China develops an interest in gold, but it never takes off in a big way. Meanwhile, they develop sets, and if you could say it like this, when you see a set of vessels, this is a set from one tomb, so it's the possessions of one person, they are using a great deal of copper, tin, and lead. And so they have abundant sources of metal, but also they have a very complex way of casting. And this form of casting is not found anywhere else. It's used with very complex ceramic molds, which predominantly are using the Loess of the central and northern China. So that not only is China doing something completely unique, but it's doing it on a large scale. So very, very quickly, it has gone from doing very little metallurgy over a few hundred years, it's producing copper alloys in a large scale. It has always used sets. The sets have been there very early. Here is a set of ceramics earlier than the bronze in a very early tomb in the Loess Plateau. And you can see that it comes from the cave houses with using of niches. I mentioned this last time, and it is the background, the support or the foundation of the use of ceramics makes it possible to develop the use of large sets of bronzes. At the same time, I think I just want to emphasize that this is based on a belief about the afterlife. It is clear that for China, burying complete possession sets in tombs began in the Neolithic period and continues throughout the Bronze Age and down to at least the 19th or 20th century. And in my book on tombs, I have mentioned this elaborately, and this is a Chinese Shang imperial tomb or royal tomb, and here is one 1,000 years later or nearly in the Qin state. So we're looking at a continuous group of people working in a continuous, as well-established belief system. And it continues with tombs right through the Qin and Han and down into the Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing. This does not stop. And one of the important features of China is that the continuities that I talk about are continuous. However, gold is not continuous. So some things are continuous and some things are not. And here we see another set of bronzes with a complete change of vessels. And there's obviously some emergency has led to the royal court of the Zhou dynasty establishing a completely new set of vessels. At the same time, we suddenly see gold again. So in the 9th century to the 7th century, there's a sudden impact of gold. And the reason is, of course, that they are in trouble with the nomadic groups into the center of the steppe. And they are certainly establishing alliances. So we see the beginnings of the use of interaction in a more diplomatic form. Instead of only invasion, we see diplomatic relations. And this man, with his wonderful bronzes in the tombs of his concubine, as well as himself, wore a gold belt. And now, if I show you the map again, you have to think of the gold belt people here in the middle. Gold and belts belong to people who have to carry weapons, and they're hunting animals and herding animals. So the belts in which you can stick daggers or hang quivers are a feature of this area. They are not a feature of the Chinese area. And they become a feature, of course, the area in the West, because we have many more animals than you do in China. And so here is a picture of the belts. So this is the origin. This is a large tomb in a place called Arjan. The earliest dates to the 9th century. This is a 7th century tomb, and his complete belt, dagger, was found. He wears boot decoration in gold. He has elaborate torques around his neck, and he wears a complete set of gold animals, more than 2,500 cast gold animals on his dress. Now, this is a sign of gold use that you do not see anywhere in China at this early date. Next to him is the man I've just shown you, the 7th century or 8th to 7th century ruler in central China, who wears a complex belt, has daggers and ornaments on his clothes, but nothing like as elaborate as the tomb in Siberia. And then at a later stage here, in the 3rd century, 4th to 3rd century, Ma Jiayuan, you see both elaborate neck ornaments and belts. And here on a bell set, a little earlier, you see people upholding the frame of the bell set, but they're wearing belts and carry swords. So there is a movement into China of the use of belts and the use of daggers. And of course, those of you who collect bronzes of belt hooks, belts themselves, and also weapons. So this is a transformation that is being taken on by the exchanges between the imperial family or the royal family of the Zhou and their dependents and their subordinate states are interacting with the people to the north and the west. The reason for this, as I will explain next time in my next lecture, is they also have to get their horses from that direction. And those horses bring in the managers, who are often people from the Mongolian steppe. So employed by the Chinese are people who work on the borders of China. They don't work as far north as Mongolia, but they live and work on the north, where we might say Inner Mongolia. So this debate with the neighbors is starting very strongly, well before the Han Dynasty, and is then going to continue down to the 20th century. One can see a few traces. For instance, this is a Persian and Achaemenid incense burner found in Iran and also in Anatolia, and it's made of silver. Here you see 2 incense burners, some of which also, like this one, have cocks on the tip. So these are a local variant of something that's inspired by the West and brings in the use of incense in a big way. So that this exchange is quite important. It alters the whole way offerings are made. It brings incense instead of food into the forefront, and from the Han Dynasty onwards and right through into the Buddhist period, incense is extremely important. At the same time, as China is developing this contact, on the far side of Eurasia is, of course, the growth of the Iranian powers and those in the Mediterranean, and becoming the Romans and Byzantines, the Sasanians, and then the merchants, the Sogdians. So if we look at the vessels that turn up both in China and in Central Asia and in Iran and in Byzantium, you see a close connection. So there is a new development with the later period after the Han Dynasty. There's a new development where both the outsiders here percolate into China, but also into Iran. And there is an exchange going on across the whole of Eurasia, which is, I would call, not just a military exchange, but a diplomatic exchange. People are exchanging and offering as gifts silver and gold, both as dishes and as cups, goblets, and as flasks, so that we see items that are not for ritual, but for banquets. And this is a complete new development, and it carries right on to the far east, if you like, to Japan. So in the Shosuin treasure, you will find items related to the Chinese, to the Turkic, the Tibetan, and even the Sogdians here and Iran, and taking you further west to Byzantium. So at this stage, the whole of Eurasia is not deeply friendly, but deliberately in a diplomatic exchange mode, which continues down to the end of the 8th century and is important technically in the ways fine silver and gold is used extensively across the whole area, crossing indeed this very arid region, with the Sogdians particularly acting as traders, Turks as challengers, and Tibetans further challengers. Now, if you're a museum curator, you have some good luck some days, and this is an example on your right of a set of porcelains I saw one evening in a museum in Zhejiang. I was there with a group of tourists acting as a tour guide when I was perhaps in my late 20s, 30s. And suddenly I saw pieces in porcelain that looked like things I knew from the British Museum. And these indeed are copies of items made of silver. So this is the silver we have in the British Museum, and you see here a handle that is at a funny angle. It has a step in it in order to get around the lid. They put the same step into this porcelain one, and the porcelain one is very insecure because this is likely to break in the kiln. And also here we see a molded porcelain, which is imitating the molded silverware. And though I didn't catch it, there is a cup that resembles this kind of cup, which is made in Sasanian Iran. So Sasanian Iran and China are forming part of this diplomatic exchange, and that has a huge impact on China turning to fine white porcelain. The silver inspires the white porcelain and changes the direction in which fine banqueting vessels are made. China does not develop a huge production of banqueting vessels in silver, but lots and lots in porcelain. So this is an important development. In looking at this exchange across Eurasia, which takes place most strongly at this time, which is between the 6th and the 10th century AD, I'm now going to turn to the thing and feature that is most Chinese of all, which is the writing. If you have one aspect of Chinese culture and civilization which dominates you, it is your writing in Chinese characters. And though when I first learned Chinese at SOAS, I was told I had to move from Fanjizi to Jiantizi very quickly. I had to move from Wei Zhao's transliteration to Pinyin. Oh dear. However, that was that. And we certainly learned first Fanjizi and then Jiantizi. And so to me, both are just possible. But it's your writing that did and does hold your culture and your civilization in one piece. And so here you have writing in an oracle bone, and here you have the cuneiform of 5th century BC, that's really late, and it's found in Turkey near Lake Van. However, this long inscription has in several languages on it, Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite. And that means that the same script as in English is used for several different languages, whereas China uses one script for all the dialects. You are forced, indeed, to communicate with the official writing, which is in Chinese characters, from the very beginning down to now. And so the resistance to changing the characters and taking up an alphabet is, I think, extremely strong and very wise. It is the single item that holds all these different regions together. And I just, for interest, show you an inscribed bronze. Here is the inscription, and in the center of the bronze at the base is this long inscription, which is about the way China is governed. China is governed by a king, and they conquered the Shang, and they offer proclamations to heaven. So here we see the fundamentals of Chinese government from very early, around 1000 BC, and also the strength and importance of the ancestors. And they are expected to offer sacrifice, to offer food and alcohol to their ancestors. So this is, it could be have written much later. This is the form of the Chinese government written in Chinese characters at a very early stage, which remained basically important through many hundreds of years, down certainly to the Qing dynasty, when it was taken up by, of course, the Manchus. And here's another example of an inscription. This is Qin Shi Huangdi inscribing his success on the mountains in eastern China, with one or two much further north. And this is also a very important development. Inscribing on mountains is a new development in the Qin Shi Huangdi period, but I'm going to show you more because they remain very essential to Chinese manifestations of authority. So we contrast them now with the Iranians, who are using sculpture for the same purpose. This is Qin Shi Huangdi, this is Darian's from Iran. And this is Iran. Here are the inscriptions in cuneiform in different languages, not a single language. And here is the king proclaiming his authority over a row of different peoples that he has conquered, including a group in a hat from the steppe. And it's inscribed on a mountain. So the use of mountains, but the very different presentation is shared across Asia. And I think it's perhaps by chance that you now have inscriptions in China on mountains as you have in Iran. And at this moment, Iran becomes very important. It is at this moment that Alexander the Great, moving from the north of Greece, if you like, across Anatolia and Iran into the borders of Afghanistan and northern India, conquered the Iranian world. And he therefore took and created a hybrid of Iran and of the Hellenistic world of Greece. And this has a very important impact on China, but one that does not, in my view, endure in the Hellenistic way. In Afghanistan, you find sculptures in this area around the Pamirs and the Hindu Kush. So we're in full Afghanistan. You find capitals and masonry that could come from Greece. You also find naked sculptures of figures, both of boys and of strong men. And these are remains from Afghanistan, very well known before the Russian entry into Afghanistan. And they are, in fact, an example of the furthest reach of Hellenistic art. And I'm now going to argue that it has some effect through the Iranian contact, not from the Mediterranean, but from Afghanistan as far as China. Once more, we are dealing with the transfer across Eurasia through the arid world, but this time along what you might call the Silk Road. And if you look at the transfer is made by the Buddhists. It is not made by the steppe people. This is work by the Buddhists. I show you on the left the forms of figures that you might see in Greece or in Italy, in Rome, with figures with drapery. And then they appear in the Taxila, which is in Afghanistan. And so this is the way in which, as a result of the conquests of Alexander, the Hellenistic and Roman world met here on the edge of India. It also had a big impact in India, but above all, for China's purpose, it traveled through the Silk Road through these very famous sites of Kizil, Dunhuang, and Tuyungang. And it brought both the figural sculpture and the architecture. This is the British Museum with a typical, if you like, Hellenistic type monument with columns with architraves, with figures standing between them, dated around 400 BC. And this survived into the Middle Ages, as you see in this reliquary box. But it's important for the Gandharan art in northern India. Scenes from the Buddhist youth here in Gandhara in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. This is a carving sculpture in Berlin. And now I'm showing you something that contradicts the kind of architecture we talked about 2 days ago. It shows you an architecture with columns and arches, things and features that are typical of the Hellenistic and Roman West. If, however, you go to China, you see them recurring. Here in Yungang, you get columns and this pointed, if you like, little figure of a triangle is in fact the architrave from the Nereid monument. And you get different moldings that come indeed from that area and figures within arches. So the arch and the figure and the columns and the capitals have moved as a whole group into China, and they do not survive. You cannot build this way in Loess. So it's only in stone caves that it can be represented as a carved surface. So this is the Gandharan figure of the Buddha. This is one of the famous Yungan figures, a very large, enormous one. And this is a cave, one of many caves in Yungan. And you have seen them also at Luoyang. I'm not going to take Buddhism much further, but to say the idea of figures moved well into China and used in all sorts of religious contexts, but the arches and the architecture did not. So here is a nice group of figures that are in the British Museum with different deities in different materials, which are all representative of different groups of ideas and beliefs that are dominant down to the 20th century. So Buddhism, a military deity, Guan Yu, a Taoist shrine, a stellar deity, and a civil deity, all of different periods, different materials, and abundantly used in China. What Buddhism became, and what I want to emphasize, is the importance of Buddhism in China as being reported in texts. It took people like Kumarajiva in Central Asia to do the translation, and he was so important that one of the rulers in the Hoshi Corridor took him back down to the Hoshi Corridor way from Xinjiang. But the importance of survival of Buddhism depends not on the sculpture, but on the texts. And it is in China and in Japan that Buddhism has survived in a textual form. And this comes indeed from Dunhuang. But just as interesting are here carvings on stone on the mountains. This is Taishan, one of the 5 sacred mountains of China. And this is the Dharma Sutra, one of the major texts of Buddhism, and it's carved and still is there today in the surface of the rock. And this is not just found in this one site, it's found in a whole range of sites across Shandong province and in Sichuan province, in Hebei, Henan, and Shanxi. So this is an important feature of China, and it is based on the interest and, if you like, the formal reveration for mountains. So this is an entirely Chinese development of Buddhism and a very, very important form of monumentality that is special for China. Nowhere else do you find this abundant inscription of mountains with a whole variety of texts, but many of them Buddhist. And this is an undervalued, if you like, series of monuments, many of the 6th to 8th to 10th centuries, and they're much recorded in a joint project by the Hangzhou China Academy and Heidelberg University and the German Academy. And this is a joint project that is published in many volumes and is a great joint success. Now, Buddhism is not the only form of inscription on mountain, and here is another one on Taishan. This is the top of Taishan with a large inscription of the Emperor Xuanzong on accounting or describing the Feng and Shan sacrifice to heaven and earth. And these very famous sacrifices were made by a limited number of the emperor, and at the same time as making offerings to the heaven and earth, he's making offerings to his ancestors. So you see here the poly feature of Chinese belief systems. And Buddhism undoubtedly shows many features of the concern for the members of families and ancestors. But this is a very, very important mountain with several hundred, if not thousands of inscriptions, most of them recording non-Buddhist features. And here there's one of Chairman Mao. He never went to Taishan, but someone has carved his calligraphy. This is the Chairman Mao's calligraphy, which is carved here at Taishan by someone who's a good inscriber of stones. I mean, inscribing on stones in fine calligraphy is not an easy task and is done by specialists. Here is an example of Chairman Mao in a photograph or painting where he's writing his own poetry. And it's a very important feature of Chinese rulers and of high officials that they are experts in calligraphy. And we should not therefore underestimate the importance of the Chinese character. It is one of the salient features of Chinese culture. It is there in changing the way Buddhism is seen in China and changing the way in which rulership is extolled and presented to the spirits. This map is, of course, central to our understanding, and I've just mentioned the transfer of Buddhism from northern India here across north of Tibet, across the Silk Road, if you like, to China, but it is not the sculpture nor the architecture that is important to China. It is both the multiplicity of beliefs that it produced in China and above all the use of the character, both in ascribing Buddhist texts on mountains, which were then followed by or used with big and important presentations of the rulers, if you like, the rulers' important role in offering sacrifice to heaven, so that the height of the mountain takes the ruler nearer to heaven. And with that, I've come to the very end with two pictures which show the contrast between China, between gold and the West. The Jade world and the gold world are still separated. And here is a scene of a battle. This is a record, a monument on this huge column in Rome, showing the Romans defeating the barbarians who are lying on the ground. And they're riding. So the riders are being defeated and defeating the Romans. Here in China, we have something quite different. We have the whole army for the first emperor forming standing. It is not a monument. It is the provision of the army for the afterlife, for the Qin Shi Huangdi to fight against the people he has already killed and who are facing him in the afterlife. So we have two completely different cultures and in completely different ways of representing that culture. To me, the symbolism is, of course, in gold and jade, but there are many, many features of this contrast. I talked about the buildings 2 days ago, and I will talk about more contrasts next week. But above all, both the Chinese culture with its very strong beliefs, its very strong manufacturing and presentation of great porcelain, of these great terracottas, of bronzes and of jade, is one of the most important aspects of the world, and it should never be underestimated, and I value it greatly, and I thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Rawson. Please remain on stage. What a lecture in 50 minutes. I wish we had 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, the whole afternoon here. So now it's come to the conversation session. May we now also invite Dr. Daisy Wang, our Deputy Director of the Hong Kong Palace Museum, onto stage to have a conversation with Professor Rawson.
Thank you so much, Professor Rawson. We learned a lot. What a stimulating and rich talk. Thank you so much. Thank you. I brought a vintage book. This was my Bible, my Jade Bible, authored by Professor Rawson. And you see, I did work on it. A lot of stickers. And since I had this opportunity to interview you, I will also be selfish. I'll ask you to sign the book for me later. So since your talk is about gold and jade, so I'm going to start the conversation with the first question about the jade. Because I was so stimulated by your idea about the transmission of gold and metallurgy from West Asia and Europe to China. But also you have one very nice slide with a map about the spread of jade culture, both in China and other parts of Asia. So could you elaborate a little bit more on sort of the influence of Chinese jade on other parts of Asia, and even perhaps westward a little bit?
Jade is, of course, actually fundamental to China, and I think its soft surface but hard quality is almost a symbol of how China should see itself. It also has all sorts of connotations with immortality. Jade was very mysterious to Europeans, and they were very muddled and didn't know what it was anyway, and they were confused by its many colors. In fact, some of the most valuable jade is pale and white, but the Europeans were looking hard to find green jade. So I would say that green jade and the dark jade, which comes mainly from Lake Baikal, has had a huge impact on Western views of what jade is. I think the group of people who were most influenced by jade are actually the northern Indian area of the Mughal rulers and their palaces and their court. And though I haven't seen it yet, I look forward to seeing the Mughal exhibition here. So the Mughals actually developed very great skill in carving jade or working jade to make very, very fine bowls. So it's very, very difficult to work jade. You have to do it with a sharp sand, often what we call corundum in English, and then that you can carve patterns in it as well, but these are work of intensely experienced craftsmen. In fact, also very interesting in the Mughal area is jade is used often as the staff or handle of a weapon. So there are absolutely excellent examples in northern India and in Iran. So the Iranian northern Indian world, I think, picked up jade in a very subtle and new way. Of course, jade had been used for some weapons in China, but mainly for weapons that are buried, whereas the Mughals and the Iranians used them for weapons they intended at least to display in the court. It was nothing to do with the afterlife, and they're very brilliantly made. So that I would say that the biggest use of fine jade is in northern India and Iran. Of course, there is some in Central Asia because the sources of jade, which are used by China particularly, began to be in China, but over time they were exhausted and they turned to what is Xinjiang and Khotan or Hetian, depends how you pronounce it, where jade is most abundant. But there are jades made in Central Asia, but they're much less fine than those from northern India and Iran.
Thank you so much. If you have not visited the Hong Kong Palace Museum special exhibition, Treasures of the Mughal Court, you can actually visit it this afternoon after the talk. It's in our Gallery 8. And like Louis said, you have to buy a ticket. And also, just sort of to supplement a little bit, we found the discussion of jade was very interesting in this exhibition because we heard from the curator of the V&A saying that actually the rulers actually used Hetian jade to carve out things. And then a century later, Qianlong Emperor admired the Mughal jade so much, so he used maybe Chinese jade or other kinds of jades to imitate Mughal jades.
Completely right, yes. The Qianlong Emperor, who was a very broad-minded art collector of every sort, he was quite an amazing man. He certainly knew about Mughal jade and certainly had Mughal jade copied or made in the workshops of the palace, probably, or in southern China, or wherever good jade carving was.
So sort of the cultural interaction is never sort of one way or two way, back and forth. Always.
Back and forth, yes.
My next question is about gold.
Gold, yes.
So we all remember that a few years ago, 2013 and 14, we did amazing exhibition on the new discoveries from Sanxingdui. And our key image is that gold mask. And I was told that the gold mask weighs about 350 grams. And it's more than, it's 85% purity. So that translates into 20K. And we also had a lot of rumor saying that, oh, where would it be Chinese people learn all about this gold working techniques? And you have one slide showing, Mixiang use of gold. So how would you place that sort of the Sanxingdui gold in the context of discussion?
Sanxingdui is pretty mysterious. It's a kind of like a firework. It goes up in the air and comes down, and that's the end of it. And it's very surprising. And I would say it's one of the big surprises that China has thrown at the world. We didn't know that, we knew that Sanxingdui had some very interesting things, but we didn't know they were on such a scale, such diversity, and such strange combinations. So it's, in terms of creativity, it's quite exceptional. In terms of later history, it's very, disappointing in a way. Why didn't they go on? Why did they stop? And I don't know the answer to that. I think the gold requires more analysis, but it almost certainly comes from the neighboring mountains. There is no gold where you have Loess, and there is no gold on the North China Plain where you have deep, deep earth and lots of crops and no mountains. You have to have mountains to have gold. And the most important mountains are the mountains of the Altai. Altai means gold in Mongolian. So the Altai is the source of a lot of gold, but there's no reason why it should be the source for the gold in Sanxingdui. It could come from the edge of Tibet. I have no idea, and I don't think people know at present. They certainly speculate about it, but I think they're finding interpreting Sanxingdui quite a challenge. We don't know who they were. We don't know how they managed their society. We know they were in contact with central China because they copied their vessels. They used many of the shapes, but they used them in a most creative way. And so it's a unique place with a unique culture, and we need to have much, much more research. Everything I've talked about 2 days ago and today requires more research. I'm talking at the edge of speculation. It's not definite what I say, but I do think much more research will be required on Sanxingdui and above all where its gold came from.
Thank you so much. The next question is a little bit about methodology, because we're so impressed at the way how you approach a question from the perspectives of geology, geography, agriculture, many different perspectives. So of course, the presentation is mainly visual. I know that you have many books, but can you offer our researchers here a few thoughts about can we do more in terms of studying the also transmission of techniques and technology?
Well, on one hand, I used to, and I came to Chinese understanding by working in the British Museum. So initially, I was looking at the transfer of ornament with Buddhism to China. But though this transfer is important, I have come to think that traveling through China's many different regions is also extremely important, because each region is different. And so what I think we also need to understand is, how did China bring together all these regions. And that's why in part, I ended with the characters, because the language is one way China has held itself together. I am myself and very much influenced by living in England and being surrounded by the British Museum and, of course, the University of Oxford, where access to people who do geology is very easy, and talking to climate specialists is fairly easy. That's less easy, but I have also made it a strong part of my life in the later years to visit the big institutes in Beijing to meet geologists, climate specialists, and animal specialists. So these come in next lecture. And I do think that China's very special landscape and geology and the shape matters a lot. And I think it would be easy. This is why I make these contrasts. I use the contrasts, you could say, as a methodology. It's easier for me to see how China is if I contrast it with Britain or the islands and the peninsulas of Europe. So we have a vast sea dominance of our culture from very early down to today. China has this much more solid landscape. It does have sea relations to Japan or the Pacific, and I'm sure they're worth following up. But above all, it's about holding a vast territory together in a unified culture, making the best use of its own technologies, whereas we, who are traveling around in little boats and big boats, are using everybody else's technologies. In Britain, French food is the top, and French clothes are the top, and so on. So that an Italian and French wine and American wealth, you know, all these things matter a lot in Europe, whereas I think China matters most to itself because it's a large area with a large number of people and a lot to give to each other. So Hong Kong and Beijing are completely different, and your exchanges between these areas are very important.
Thank you. Well, since I work on later period art, so I cannot help asking you a question about the Qing dynasty, sorry. Because we all know that you have done a wonderful and a groundbreaking exhibition called Three Emperors, which include, of course, our beloved Qianlong Emperor as well. So that was about 20 years ago, and the field has changed quite a bit since then. I don't know whether you actually have a chance to look at our Qing and Ming art galleries featuring objects from the Forbidden City. But I don't know whether you can offer some thoughts in terms of, you know, if you were given an opportunity to do it again, what could be different?
Well, I would very much like to work on the Qing dynasty, actually. I think the Qing is wonderful. I think you have the three, especially Kangxi and the Qianlong emperors are two of the greatest rulers of the world, not just of China, but of the world. But I'm grateful that I didn't choose the Qing because I would have to read all those documents in the Forbidden City in Chinese. And actually, I'm not up to that. And so I very much admire, and I'm very friendly with people who are Qing specialists. And I had a really wonderful experience in preparing the exhibition, The Three Emperors, and going to Beijing and discussing the possibility of borrowing material and how they organized their museum and where it was. So I do think the Qing dynasty is extremely important. I think Europeans greatly underestimated China under the Qing. They did not appreciate the way in which the Qing melded themselves with the existing Han culture and created a very, very strong unified culture in both the main core, if you like, and in Xinjiang and bits of Mongolia. I think they were extremely important to you today. And I think now I hope that they are much applauded by the Chinese generally, even if they came initially from outside. So I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I'm not specialist enough in the reading of court documents to study the Qing. But It was a great experience. I probably worked on that exhibition for 3 years, and I would certainly do it again. And I would certainly hope that everybody, both in China and the West, would appreciate the achievements of the Qing dynasty and their wonderful works of art. So I'm all for it.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's give our Professor Jessica Rawson a big round of applause.
Thank you so much, Professor Rawson and Daisy, for such an inspiring discussion. May we now invite Dr. Ng to present a gift. Yes. So this gift is a very special memories for the Hong Kong Palace Museum. It comprises of 3 of our recent in-house published catalog dedicated to 3 exhibitions that are the Gazing at Sanjing Day, a Movable Feast, and the Origins of Chinese Civilizations, all published by our in-house team. And these books are still available in our shop if you want to grab the last few copies. May we also invite the following distinguished guests to join them for a second photo. Ms. Lillian Ken, CEO of Beishan Foundation, and Professor Maggie Wang, Head of Graduate Division of the Department of Fine Arts to Chinese University of Hong Kong. Once again, we would like to thank the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the Beishan Foundation for their generous support in making this talk possible. The live stream is coming to an end. Thank you all for all the online viewers with us. See you next time.